Well, I am so excited to welcome Al, you here in person to the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Jen.
And Randy, it's a second best. It's a far cry from having you here in person, but a second best is to have you virtually on the screen. So I'm so glad you could join us to talk about this important book. I'm sorry that the weather in Mississippi didn't cooperate. Maybe you could say a word about that. What happened down there that prevented you from coming?
I've got a glass of hot chocolate, which that's something we never or rarely drink. So that tells you, yeah, we had snow here for the first time in 7 years in Hattiesburg, which is in South Mississippi. So very unusual. And the roads to get to the airport in Gulfport, about an hour away, last night, some of those roads were not only ice, they were closed.
Oh,
so
boy.
If I had wanted to come, I couldn't have caught that plane. So,
yeah. Well,
anyway.
good choice. We'll get you back here. You made a good choice, and I'm really grateful and appreciative that you could join us. Find it in your calendar to join us today virtually. I know you guys have a special friendship, and I'd like to just start with the question: How did you meet? And what's nurtured your friendship along the way?
I'll let Randy start with that.
Well, John, this may anticipate another question you have later on, but I've been interested in faith at work, the faith at work movement for a long time, growing out of a friendship with someone that all three of us knew well, Pete Hammond, who was my InterVarsity staff worker here at Southern Miss more than 50 years ago. But Pete was the one that sort of started me on that road probably 30 years ago, and I decided I'd like to have some more formal training in that or education. And so I think it was 2012, I began to look for programs at seminaries or colleges or universities that would offer that and found two. One was at Regent College in Vancouver. The other was at Gordon Conwell Seminary. The difference was that at Regent College, I had to move there for a year, which I could not do. So I enrolled in the program at Gordon Conwell, and Al and David Gill were the two major professors in that program. So that's how I met Al for the first time. So it's been, Al, 12 or 13 years ago since we first met. I had no idea who Al was up until then. I don't think I had ever heard of you, Al, and I'm sure he had never heard of me either. But that was a good experience, and I did get my master's from Gordon Conwell about 5 years later.
Wonderful. Boy, that's quite a combination. Pete Hammond, David Gill, and Al Erisman. I'm pondering that actually.
Yeah.
You are the product of a really talented yet interesting group of men.
Right.
Yeah, and after that class, Randy had to get a 1 credit, small credit course, independent study, and he asked me to lead it. And we had lots of conversations about Saul and David. And Randy wrote a great piece on that, which was part of our friendship. And then Nancy and I visited in their home, and they visited in our home. And we have built that friendship over these years and look forward to getting together when we can.
Yeah, that's so nice. And Randy, I knew your name, and I know we'd met at InterVarsity conferences over the years, spent a little bit of time together. So it's wonderful to have these paths cross again through Al, because I think you and I would have gone back probably to the common Pete Hammond lineage. And
That's right. That's
the ministry and daily life work that he did for InterVarsity. So
right.
That's wonderful. I wonder if you could just give a thumbnail of your professional background. Listeners heard a little bit about that as I read the bios, but I'd love for you to just highlight a couple of key moments in your professional vocational journey. You've had really interesting paths, and I'd love to hear you describe it.
Okay.
So, well, why don't we, Randy? We'll start with you, and then we'll come down.
Okay. Well, right out of college, between college and law school, I was on InterVarsity staff for 3 years at the University of Tennessee. Came back to Mississippi, attended the University of Mississippi Law School, and practiced law with my father here in Hattiesburg for almost 40 years, I guess. He died in 2017, but he practiced into his 80s. I had just a general civil practice. I tried cases. I helped folks with wills and contracts and just a variety of things. And when I finished the course at Gordon Conwell, I was 66 years old and really thought I would, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. So I got a call from the brand new mayor of Hattiesburg, who was 35 years old at that time, same age as my younger daughter. And he said, I want to talk to you about city attorney. And I said, I assumed he was wanting a recommendation. And I said, Mayor, I don't know many of the young lawyers. And he said, that's not why I'm calling. I want you to do this. And that was almost 8 years ago. So since then, I've been the city attorney. And if he is reelected, which I think he will be, I'll probably do it one more term. I represent the city. That's my client. But I work with the mayor and our council. So I do a variety of things with the city. I have two other clients, smaller clients, also public bodies, a solid waste management regional district and a university foundation. So those are my three clients at this point in my life. The city takes up probably 75 or 80% of my practice. And
Fascinating.
it's all sorts of things. I could go into them, but just all sorts of things. Advising the mayor and the council, sort of being, I guess, guardrails for them. I try not to tell them no too often, but if they get too close to those guardrails, I will say, I think there may be another way to do this, or occasionally I'll have to say, I don't think you can do that. But for the most part, it's just helping them make hopefully good decisions, both on the legislative side and the executive side.
Wow. Thank you. That's really helpful. Al, how about you?
Yeah. So I was teaching 8th grade math, but thinking I wanted to be a journalist. And I had some students that inspired me to reconsider mathematics. They asked me all sorts of hard questions, and I like to say they sent me to graduate school. So I finished a doctorate in mathematics at Iowa State, and instead of teaching at a university, I thought I'd go to a company for a couple of years just to see why anyone really uses mathematics. And I was going to stay 2, and I stayed 32 years at Boeing. And I ended up managing an R&D center in technology and mathematics. But along the way, I met a lot of people that influenced me. David Gill was one of them, certainly. Al Green, the founder of Bellevue Christian School, was another. And Wayne Alderson in Pittsburgh was another. I heard him interviewed on the radio, and he was vice president of a steel company. And he said, I believe that God has called me to this work and that I'm in full-time Christian ministry. And I had never thought of it that way before. And it began my thinking about how I could do that in the Boeing Company. And the Boeing Company wrote my paycheck, but I was in full-time Christian service. That meant that God cared about mathematics. He cared about technology. And my work mattered to God, but I needed to do it in a certain way that brought witness to him. It is a life that I began searching out, and I think I'm still trying to figure out what all that looks like. When I left Boeing, I taught at Seattle Pacific University. Again, I had always wanted to teach at a university. Did it for a couple of years, I thought. It ended up being 17. And I only left because I had to write a book that I was convinced by someone that I should write. And I just ended up never going back. But in the meantime, I taught at Gordon Conwell, and that's where Randy mentioned earlier. So it's been an interesting career. And I was fortunate that my wife actually also fell in love with this space of thinking about faith and work. She was way ahead of me in some ways. She started a faith and work Bible study for working women in 1997 that continued until she died and continues today. And they invited me over for their annual Christmas party, me and 12 women. And it was a wonderful remembrance of her and her influence. And so I can't talk about my career without mentioning her influence on it.
Yeah. And just to sort of finish the triangle, again, I noted Randy and I go back a number of years through Pete Hammond. Al and I go back a number of years through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and have traveled all over the world together. And maybe some of those stories will come out during our 2 days here on site. But a lot of amazing memories, both with Al and Nancy, in Central Africa, in Southeast Asia, and
University in Boston,
all kinds of places.
Atlanta.
Well, we're here to talk about this book, Living with Purpose in a Polarizing World. And I am really grateful for the wisdom in this book. And, we're going to have all kinds of links in the show notes and encourage you to go out and buy this book. And for those who are with us here in person, we'll have that available. Why did you decide to write this book? And who's it written for?
Yeah. Maybe I should start that one. I was having a hallway conversation at church, and someone said it's really hard to be a Christian in business in Seattle. There's a lot of pressure against Christians, and it really seems difficult. And I don't think I was real sympathetic. I think I said something like, "Oh, really?" Because, first of all, it isn't maybe meant to be easy. But secondly, it's not really as difficult as it is in other places in the world or in Scripture. And so it caused me to think about doing a Sunday school class by looking at narratives of Scripture and asking, how did these people live and what can we learn from them? I had 3 in mind when I started, but I had 12 weeks to teach. And so I began reading other narratives as I started and ended up recognizing that there could be 25, but I had to pick 12. And it was a really fun class. And when I got done, I said, this ought to be a book, but I shouldn't write it myself. And I'm from the middle of a blue state. Randy's from the middle of a red state. I loved his writing. I loved his thinking. And I called him up and I said, would you write this with me? We would be equal partners and we would push on each other. One of us would draft a chapter. The other would critique it, tear it up, turn it inside out. And in the end, we have to own the whole thing, both of us. And we agreed to do that. And that's my side of the story. And Randy, I'd be interested in your sharing your side of the story.
Well, yeah, this was Al's idea, no doubt. John, you may know this. I know Al knows this. I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis. We have a C.S. Lewis Society here that meets monthly, and we look at different of his works. He has an essay called Learning in Wartime. I don't know if you're familiar with that essay.
Yes.
But in it, he talks about how, of course, it was written right as World War II was beginning. He talks about how we tend to think, in his case, we tend to think war is something that is unusual. It rarely happens. But if you look at the history of the world, the peace and tranquility are actually the rules, and conflict and war are the exceptions. So I've sort of applied that in my thinking to the Bible, to these narratives. we may come initially with the idea that the characters in Scripture lived in comfortable and easy times, but that is almost never the case as you look carefully at the stories. So I've used that sort of as a model, I guess you'd say, that this is the norm. As Al has said, you could find almost every character in Scripture. Some of them make all kinds of mistakes. We tried not to whitewash the characters. We tried to be honest with their learning process. They all learned. They didn't start out saints, I guess you'd say, when they began, except for Jesus, of course. But so anyway, that's kind of the way I see it. It was an opportunity to look at characters their cultural settings may have been somewhat different from mine, but there were a lot of similarities, and so I think they're very relatable to today. So that was one of the things that attracted me.
Yeah. What's the structure of the book, and then how did you choose the characters to focus on?
Well, we wanted to introduce the topic, and I think Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 actually set the tone for the whole structure. Seeing that you're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, that is the narratives of Scripture, let's start with ourselves. Let's lay aside the sin that affects us. Often when we think about cultural conflict, we start with the other guy, but let's start with ourselves. And then let's run the race that is marked out for us. And that was the case for them, and it's the case for us. But we don't do it on our own. It says looking to Jesus. And so that laid the groundwork for it. As far as the narratives that we wanted to do, we wanted to look for narratives where there was a lot of material, so that we wouldn't be making up a lot of the background pieces, but that they would be laid out. And there are many, many long narratives in Scripture, and we picked some of them. And we picked them because they offered kind of a different view. Each one had a different kind of problem area. Each one worked in a different place. Almost all of them were in the marketplace, which most Christians kind of ignore. They spiritualize it, when we wanted to say, no, wait a second, what really happens in the workplace. And in the end, we left out some that I would love to have included. We had to limit ourselves, and we picked 11. And then we had a long discussion about Jesus. He's not the same as the others, and I didn't want to make him the same. But on the other hand, we couldn't leave him out of this conversation, because what he taught and what he did models for us how we live in a polarizing world. So we included his in the group. Randy, maybe you should drop in some of the things that you were thinking about in these characters.
Well, yeah, of course, there's more narratives in the Old Testament than there is in the New Testament. So we wound up with 9 from the Old Testament and 3 from the New Testament. But as Al said, we did talk a while about whether to include Jesus. And I think, if you think about it, if there was ever anybody that lived in a polarizing world, it was Jesus himself. The Romans, the Jews, the Gentiles, it was all over everywhere. And in some ways, I guess you could say he maybe more than anybody else lived in a polarizing world. He was pulled in a lot of different directions, but he stayed focused. He knew what he wanted to do, what he was supposed to do, and is a good model for us, I think.
Yeah. I want to come back in a few minutes and ask you about a favorite or two. But I wonder if you could share your hope for how this book can help those in the church. So I'd love to hear that story. And then you very intentionally used the word polarizing instead of polarized. And I think that's maybe just a little bit of a difference than what we're typically, I guess what we're used to hearing. We hear polarized more. Why did you make that choice? But first, how do you hope this book will be helpful?
As I've looked at the Christian community, and I think of the colleague that I was talking with at church, I think we tend to believe that somehow God owes us a comfortable life that will be free of pain and difficulty and challenge, and that it ought to be easy. And I don't see any record of that anywhere in Scripture. And so I'm hoping that people will kind of reorient from this. I'm going to withdraw from culture. I'm going to be angry. I'm going to use my power to dominate and take a different approach of how do we actually love others who are made in the image of God? How do we walk with humility? I can give you one example of something that I think has already been helpful. There were a lot of people that said, well, this book was about the election. And I said, actually, no, it's not about the election, because when you think about it, Daniel didn't get to vote for Nebuchadnezzar, and Joseph didn't get to vote for Pharaoh, and Esther didn't get to vote for Xerxes, and Peter didn't get to vote for Nero. They were all stuck in that position of working for someone like this. So actually, when we think about that now, we say, yeah, half of the people in the country are upset about the election. But that isn't the point. The point is, this is the world where we have been placed. How do we navigate this and represent Christ well? And if we got people even thinking about that question, I think that would be a big help, and that's what I would hope.
Yeah, you read all this data about how people make choices around where they live now, where they attend church, and you have red and blue churches, red and blue townships. I mean, it's a real problem, and we need radical help on this, right? To figure out how to live together.
And if I could add one other point, we do go to churches and live in neighborhoods of people like us. That's just the way things seem to be going. But in the workplace, we don't have that choice. And this is the connection to faith and work. The big connection for me is that in that world, we live in a very diverse world. And we need to represent Christ well in that world. So I hope they get that out of this too. And Randy, I know you thought about this question. What about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll take a little different tack, Al. That I think that was part of the strength of the book, John, is that Al and I might come at it a little bit differently. I had somebody who read the book very early and said to me he had grown up in church, been to church his whole life, but he said, I've never read the stories in the Bible the way that you and your co-author presented them. The stories themselves sort of invite you in to, sort of a what would you do? How would you feel? How did this person learn, and how can you learn? And so I think the way we use the stories themselves in terms of the church, I would hope that the church would see not that these stories are just stories for children or stories sort of a starting point for another discussion, but the stories themselves lend themselves to, okay, I can enter that story, I can see myself there, and my thinking can be reshaped as a result of wrestling with the characters in this story, learning from them both what to do and what not to do. So I think the stories themselves, as I say, invite you in, and that's one way I think that the church can benefit from this particular book.
Randy, I wonder, Al, did you want to
Well, I was just going to add one other point. So I think the net of what we both said, and I really appreciate Randy's perspective, I always have, is that this is written for Christians who want to take their faith seriously and enter into their faith in maybe a bigger way. But there's a second group, and that is people that are not Christians, but that are wondering about the world. And I wasn't really expecting that, except that I've had two people write to me and say, you don't have to be a Christian to get something from this, because these are ancient stories that cause us to think about things maybe in a different way about how we interact with others. And it's my hope and prayer that this book would also be for non-Christians who would say, maybe Christianity is not what I read about in the newspaper, but it's something deeper than that, and I want to learn more.
Yeah.
And so I have some hopes for that part as well.
Yeah, that's great. I want to go to a character or two. I think this will be helpful for our listeners and bring the chapters to life. Randy, let me start with you. Could you, who's your favorite character that, after writing the book, you thought, I learned something here. I really enjoyed reflecting on the life of this person. I wonder if you could just bring that person to life a little bit and how you developed the character in the chapter.
Well, Al, I'm going to steal the character from that we talked about the other day, Abraham. I mean, I think I will say, John, that Daniel and Joseph are probably the two most obvious ones that Al was talking about a little while ago. They didn't choose to be where they were, but Abraham. We did not spend any time in the Abraham chapter, which I was the original author of that chapter. Al added some excellent things that he may want to talk about, but we spent our time looking at maybe incidents in Abraham's life that were not as well known. One of them was the Abraham's discussion with God. I guess you'd call it a discussion when God is going to destroy, or he intends to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. As a lawyer, I don't know if you remember in the book, I talked about how God really almost takes the witness stand and lets Abraham cross-examine him and ask him questions rather than telling him this is how justice works. This is how justice works. He lets Abraham explore that idea with him almost on the witness stand, as it were. So that's one particular example that I think I used in the book and talked about. This is very, there was not. It was not sort of an arbitrary thing. Abraham, you don't know anything. This is the way it's going to work. He let him question him. Just an amazing thing, an amazing scene for God, amazing thing for God to do that with Abraham. That was part of his education. And one of the themes in the book, in the chapter on Abraham, is, and for all of these people really, is how they went through an education process. And I think the image I used, which was not original, but the image in the Abraham chapter was God took him by the hand and basically took him to school on how he wanted to live a different life than that he had grown up with and that was true of the surrounding culture. So Abraham is a great example, but and so, Al, I'm sorry if I stole your character there, but I know you've got some others you can talk about. But that was one, John, that I've thought a lot about.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's I've never had that image of God inviting Abraham into the moot court, and really doing legal education, right? I mean, in some ways, he's modeling his character and really. Allowing Abraham to develop, right, to walk into his calling.
Right.
That's a powerful image. How about you, Al?
Well, let me take the Daniel, and I'll take just one incident from Daniel. Early on, Daniel was taken captive. He had a promising career where he was, and yet he was in an enemy land. The enemy wanted to train him to be a loyal government employee. They changed his name. They gave him a history. They gave him the philosophy, theology, all of the things associated with a new country. And Daniel could have objected to all of those things, and he didn't. He picked his battle very carefully, and he chose to talk about what food he would eat. And I find it really intriguing to think, I can't fully get inside his head, but to think about the fact that he would make an issue out of the one thing and not everything. Second thing is, I was trained on Bible stories, and I'd heard this story forever. And it was kind of presented to me as Daniel was in your face. I'm not going to eat from that food. No way. Take it away from me. Standing by himself, I had the song in my mind, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. And I read the story, and he wasn't standing alone. He had some friends with him. He had a community around him. He wasn't disrespectful. He listened to the plight of the person who was the leader, and he said, yeah, I guess it's your head if we don't turn out well. How about if we try it this way, and if that doesn't work, we'll do it your way. What do you think? I mean, the respect, the humility, and the community are guides for us as we think about a hard spot that we are in. And so just seeing that in Daniel's life and the way he carried out that conversation was just an amazing thing to me. But since you said one or two, let me mention briefly one other one. I love the story of Job, but in studying it from this perspective, I realized that what Job came to realize is that God is God and we are not. And I think too often we think we're going to second guess God. He doesn't know what he's doing here. Why are we in this spot? Why are we in the 21st century? Rather than saying, what does God have for me here? And Job coming to the realization that God is God and it's not all about me is something that I think we all have to get to if we're going to navigate our world.
Yeah, that's so helpful. One of the things that you do in these chapters is you weave in personal examples from your life, your maybe personal stories or stories, contemporary stories of people you've come across, who you've come across with, that you've companies, institutions that you've had experiences with. I wonder if you have a favorite contemporary example from the book that just illustrates beautifully one of the characters or one of the stories. I'd love to hear from both of you.
You go ahead.
Okay. So I think about this whole idea of humility, and I think about something that I learned in an interview that I did with Peter Pace, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I said to him, how would you advise a younger person to enter into a conversation? Because on the one hand, maybe they're intimidated, but on the other hand, they have ideas. He said, I usually tell them, always tell the truth as you know it, and always know that you don't know all of the truth. That will give you a sense of humility, a sense of limitation of what you know, but would allow you to contribute. And then I look back at Daniel and at Joseph and at Abraham in various situations where they were. And I realized that, yes, they could have been intimidated, or yes, they could have demanded something, but their approach, think of Joseph before Pharaoh. He listened carefully. He responded to Pharaoh's question. He gave some great insight, but it wasn't about Joseph. And I just think that modern example and these biblical characters just lined up for me and offered some insight that I find helpful.
Great. Yeah. Randy, how about you?
Yeah, I did use this story in the book. We use this story. I mentioned to you that the mayor that I work with was 35 years old when I became city attorney. He's the same age as my younger daughter.
Mm-hmm.
But he was the first millennial elected to the Mississippi legislature. He served there for 10 years before becoming mayor. But in the middle of his first term, he was elected in 2017 to his first term. We had COVID that came along. And like a lot of places, there were people on one side that were saying, you're being too restrictive. On the other side, people saying you're not being restrictive enough. And I remember very distinctly a television reporter asking him, do you read the comments on Facebook when you do a new executive order for something? And he did about 20 of them, and I had to review all 20 of them before they went out. But I remember him saying, I do look at the comments on Facebook, but I can't govern that way. I've got to govern based on the best information that I have. I have to think about a lot of different things. And so I'll have to say it was pretty remarkable for somebody that young to take that approach and to say, I understand there are strong feelings on both sides, but I've got to do what's best, what I think is best for the city. That's what I was elected to do. And as you may remember from the book, in the next election, he was reelected by 85% of the vote.
Yeah.
So,
Great story. Great story. I want to explore what you learned about writing this book together. And maybe COVID is a good lead into this question. You write about it in the afterword, and it's wonderful. I just really encourage people, maybe go to the afterword first. But what'd you learn about this shared project?
Well, I guess number one, I learned that we all live in a bubble. We really do. Al mentioned the red state and the blue state, and he's has a PhD in applied mathematics. I've been practicing law for almost 50 years. We have a lot in common, but there's a lot of things that are different about us as well. So, but I think, as he said, wrestling with issues that we may not see eye to eye on was valuable. I don't think there's any question that our underlying friendship allowed us to do that and allowed us to still be friends at the end of writing the book. There were 3 or 4 things that we never did reach agreement on. We still don't agree on, but I think we agreed on probably 98.5% of everything that and sometimes it was him pushing back that I would say, I can see where you're coming from, and I think he did the same thing. So I think for me, it was realizing that I live in a bubble, that I benefit. And of course, the scripture talks about iron sharpening iron. I think that was very much the experience of both of us, that our ideas and our thinking is sharpened by bumping up against somebody who may not think exactly like we do. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the big things that I learned. But I don't want to oversell that point. We agreed on far more than we disagreed on. The disagreements took longer to work through, but it was a great project. It's a little bit like I ran a marathon when I was 30 years old, and a few weeks later, somebody said, are you looking forward to your next one? I said, I've done that. I don't know that I have to do that again. But if I knew then what I know now, I would still do it. So it was a great overall experience.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Al.
If I could maybe illustrate one of those disagreements, when I was writing a draft of the Ruth chapter, I recognized that Ruth was in a very vulnerable position. She was an immigrant. She was a laborer. She was vulnerable to sexual harassment, and the scripture tells us that. And it says that Boaz saw that, and he put protection around her. And I wrote as naturally as just sitting there, I just said, in modern language, we would refer to Boaz as woke. And then I put an asterisk by it. And I said, using the original definition of woke, which is aware of and empathetic toward the vulnerable, particularly racial and ethnic minorities. And I felt like that was a really good statement. And it would be helpful to readers to recognize that what they saw, a word that they probably put in a particular category, might not fit quite as tightly in that category. And I remember getting the call from Randy after he read this, and he said, we can't use woke. And we went back and forth on this for probably 2 weeks. And in the end, some students that I talked with at Seattle Pacific actually convinced me that while they agreed with my position, the fact is that there would be some people that would stop reading when they saw that word. And if they stopped reading, they couldn't learn from it. And so I agreed. And I think that was Randy's point all along. It just took those students to help me see that. And so we took it out. But we did talk about it then in the afterword. And I think that the idea of being able to talk about these things, even when you disagree, is very important in learning. And I think we both learned from that. There are some other things in the book that you'll find. There are a couple places where we couldn't get to full agreement, and we got as close to agreement as we could. And then it says, and Al would go further and say this, and it represented the place where we said, okay, we agreed to this point, and then one of us would take it further than that. And I felt like we were being honest. We never gave up what we were both passionate about, but we also found, I think, a way to sharpen our friendship and our discourse. And I hope that by itself, that illustrates the theme of the book. And maybe I could address one of the other questions you raised, John. We said the word polarizing rather than polarized for this simple reason, that whatever the issue is today, there will be new issues tomorrow and new issues the next year. And if we say polarized, we think we're going to address the world as it is right now and say, how do we overcome the divisions right now? But there will continue to be new ones. How do we actually consciously be aware that the issues will keep changing, and we have to keep applying the scripture to the new issues and understanding the world in the new way? And we won't get it right by ourselves. And that's why I so much appreciate Randy, because in this community, we could push each other back and forth and maintain respect and friendship.
And I think it's important, a point that you made earlier, Al. If you look in the book, you'll find almost nothing about politics, about national politics, though that's when we've talked about this together, inevitably, it's almost the first question somebody asked: did you write this in response to or in anticipation of the presidential election of 2024? And our answer is no, because, as Al says, I think he's exactly right. The issues are going to change, but that's the whole point of doing the book the way we did it. The principles and the examples from Scripture are not going to change. Yeah. So they can be applied in whatever the new issues might be. So many books, John, I know you know, a book comes out and a year later it's out of date. Hopefully this one won't be out of date that quickly.
Yeah. Well, and there's there are so many biblical characters. We're going to be ready for volume 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, the
Well,
Old Testament.
I told you the marathon story, right? So,
I'd love to hear a story, maybe a success, and if you're willing to share a failure of how you have tried to practice these principles in your own life.
Yeah.
I guess I could. Of course, as a lawyer, one of the things that I have done over the years is to part of what I do sometimes involves representing multiple clients when they don't get along with each other. And I wish I could say I think the example I gave in the book was of an estate with two brothers and a sister. And I would like to think that I could be, or I attempted to be in that situation, a peacemaker and somebody who could help deal with a very polarized family. This was after the mother had died, an estate, but I was unsuccessful. I don't know if that's a good example or not. Sometimes when you try to act as a peacemaker, somebody to bring to deal with polarization, you're not successful. That was a pretty good example of me in my professional life. That's not the only one. I wish it was, but that's happened more than once.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do domestic relations, but estates can be just as nasty as domestic relations can be. And I've seen that, brothers and sisters fighting each other. I've represented, you have to be careful when you get in that situation when you're representing more than one person. But anyway, that's a pretty good example of a failure, I guess, to help somebody else deal with a polarized situation. Certainly the election, even in our own families, we have polarizations in national politics that I think are no better, if not worse, than they were even 8 years ago. So it's hard work to do, to try to help folks and to deal with polarization yourself, I guess. So those are some examples for me, John.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Al.
Yeah, I can think of an example of a boss that was really difficult to deal with, and I don't think I really made the effort that I needed to make to understand his perspective. And one day, God kind of dropped this in front of me. I was waiting for a meeting with him, and talking with his secretary, and she has said, Phil was the best man at his son's wedding last weekend. And I said, wow. And I thought about that a lot. And I went back to my staff and I said, I know we've been struggling in our relationship with him, but he was the best man at his son's wedding. His son knew him really well and valued him. Why don't we spend a little more time looking for what it is we could value in him and a little less time on what we are frustrated by? And I think maybe that's the key in some of our current conversations. It's pretty easy to find the place where we differ with someone. What if we look for a place where we can agree? And what can we learn from this person who brings a different set of experiences? And I don't say I do this well. I've probably failed at it many more times than I've succeeded. But writing this has caused me to think much more carefully about this idea of what can I learn from them rather than what can I critique about them. And I don't say that I've got it mastered by any means, but I do say that I believe it's important, and I think that's something I've learned.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you for those examples. I'd like to turn on the podcast and talk a little bit about your experience in the work and faith movement, because I think it's just really important. You both have so many experiences. in this arena. You've written this book looking at biblical characters in Scripture through the lens of polarization. What have you learned about reading Scripture through the lens of work and faith? I know that's a huge question, but you're so steeped in this world. I'd love to hear how God is teaching you, has taught you, what you're learning about His character as you think about Scripture through the lens of work and faith.
Well, Al, one of the phrases Al likes to use a lot is the idea of assignment. He referenced it not long ago, that God has called us to a particular place and a particular time. I think for me, it one of the important things is that I am somehow mysteriously guided. I was guided to this role that I've been in for almost 8 years. But it's not necessarily in the gigantic things that we are, that we can make a difference where we are. A lot of times it's in very ordinary things, but it's the way, as Al has said before, we deal with people, we treat them with respect, we model, hopefully, those sorts of things. I can think of, any number of things lately that have come across my desk and that I've had to deal with. I think at our ages, Al's got a couple of years on me, but we're both over 70. I'll put it that way. I think the opportunity to mentor younger folks. I mentioned the mayor, who's now 43 years old. There are others in the city administration I'm the old guy in the city administration, but the opportunity to mentor, I think it's not, I haven't sought people out to try to work with. They seem to have come along. So for me, that's a couple of things that I would say, John, that have been important to me and are important to me now, is just seeing how can I do good work and model good work in the ordinary things of life, and then the opportunity, as God brings people along, to be a model in whatever ways it might be in the workplace. I agree with Al that the workplace is the key. I wouldn't just say a key. I think it is probably the key area of ministry for most Christians today, even though they may not recognize it.
Yeah, thank you. So all of life is laden with sacred, holy moments, and those holy moments don't seem to go away. They come in different forms, and they evolve. But you have as many opportunities today, maybe more than you've ever had.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Al, how about you?
Well, I've been involved with the Theology of Work Project, as you know, John, where we've looked at every passage of Scripture and asked the question, what does this have to say about our daily work? And through that, I've kind of become sensitive to the fact that we often spiritualize the Bible, and we read it and we think about a spiritual application, and it doesn't somehow penetrate our daily life. This project, in looking at narratives, reminds us that Joseph, Abraham, Moses, Daniel, Esther, Ruth, all these people were all in the workplace. The Bible is filled with instructions for what I would call whole life discipleship, and illustrates those through the long narratives that are in the Scripture. And how do we miss that? And I think, if anything, this study of narratives kind of awakened me to the fact that so much of Scripture is given to people in the workplace living out their lives for Him. And the call to whole life discipleship certainly is supported by this. And then going back, Hebrews 12 follows Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 points to the narratives of Scripture. Hebrews 12 says, now seeing you're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. How do you live? And so the call to whole life discipleship, I've been involved in some discipleship programs that involve reading of scripture, quiet time, sharing faith, doing volunteer things. And when you add it all up, it represents no more than 10% of a person's waking life. And the rest of life, what is that about? And I think the call to whole life discipleship and the idea of connecting faith and work are so integrally tied together that this just awakened me to seeing that in all of the narratives of Scripture and all the ones we didn't get to.
It's wonderful. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. I am grateful for the book. I really encourage folks to pick this up. Living with Purpose in a Polarizing World: Guidance from Biblical Narratives. I'm thankful for the way and the ways you continue to play a role in my life, and I'm really grateful for your friendship. Thank you for modeling friendship, even when you agree on a lot, but you don't agree on everything. You've modeled that so beautifully, and you've written about it so beautifully, and I've enjoyed the time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.